Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi, Peya, Perek Zayin, starting Halacha Gimel. We are learning Daf Samach Aleph, starting all the way on top of the Amud with the Mishnah. We're going to be moving on now to learn the dinim of Peret and Oilelois. Others pronounce it Oileles, which are two unique matnos adiyim that are given from a vineyard in addition to leaving Peya in the vineyard, in addition to Shikha in the vineyard. We also have the mitzvah of Peret, as the Mishnah will define, and Oilelois, as the Mishnah will define. We're going to have the klal in the Mishnah, as we had above, Safek, Leket, even though normally the rule would have been Hamoitz and Chavedo Olavaraya. What we learned from Sukkim, it was on Daf Mem, Daf Mem Aleph, that if there's a doubt, the owner retains ownership. Same will be applied over here, both Benegeya Peret and Benegeya Oilelois. And as we'll define, the Mishnah gives two definitions for Oilelois, that a cluster that's developed belongs to the owner. If it's an underdeveloped cluster, you have to leave it to the poor. What's the definition of an underdeveloped cluster? A cluster that does not have a shoulder, a ketev, and it does not have a native drippings, as we'll explain. Sure, Kavan will find Gavalika pictures for it. And it's interesting that the Gemara is going to add another prerequisites. Now, because of the exceptional cases where even if you have this underdeveloped cluster, as we'll see in the Mishnah, sometimes in certain circumstances, it still will remain property of the owner. Therefore, the Gemara is going to say that when we learned in Abraisa, that if a Levi receives Ma'aser Sheni from a vineyard, and he receives a lot of clusters, including oileles, which normally would have been property of the poor, the Levi has to separate from what he receives from his Ma'aser Rishon, Ma'aser Min HaMa'aser. The Levi is allowed to use the oileles as Ma'aser Min HaMa'aser, and obviously something that does not belong to me may not be used by me for my chiyuv of Ma'aseres. It cannot be used by me. It will be ineffective. The reason why, as we'll see when we learn the Gemara, a Levi is allowed to do so is because the Mishnah is going to give certain prerequisites for the oileles, even if it doesn't have the ketev and the native. V'chulei, sometimes it will still belong to the balabas, and therefore, until we know otherwise, also because of the rule, Safek, Leket, Safek, oileles, I'm sorry, not take that out. If we don't know otherwise, the Levi that received it can presume that it belonged to the owner. That's the word. There's going to be one major topic in the Gemara, just to give in the intro. The Peret, which we did not explain yet. Peret means individualized grapes that fell off the cluster while the cluster is being harvested. One or two such grapes that fell at the same time have to be left on the ground for the ani. And the question is, when do they become property to the ani? That will be a topic in the Gemara. Is it from when they hit the ground, or is it from when they fall off the cluster? And we'll see, obviously, there are nafkaminas to that, but we're going to expound that. We're going to develop that in the Gemara. We're going to probably get to the bottom of Daf Samach Aleph on the base. I don't know if we can get into the Agadata, but if you don't get into the Agadata today, I know there was very little Agadata so far. Just to be aware that, God willing, Daf Samach Beis is a daf filled with Agadata. Perhaps we will start some of it today. All right, without further ado, right, Daf Samach Aleph, let me just quote the pasuk, Hashgacha Pratas, that we have in this week's parsha. We are learning this Beis Iyur, right, the day of the Rebbe Marash, Tavshin Pei Daled, in Parshas Kedoshim. It says, "V'charmecha loisa oileil," which means don't remove the oileilois, the underdeveloped clusters, from your vineyard. Uperet karmecha loisa lake. Don't gather the individual grapes, as we said, that fell down, as to be defined in a moment. Don't gather them. Narvas yeh laani v'lager tazevois. And the pasuk concludes, "Ani Hashem Elokecha." So says the Mishnah, Ezehu Peret. What's the definition of a Peret? Says the Mishnah, Hanoisher b'shas habetzidam, the individual grape or grapes, two, not more, that fall, that one time, that fall during the harvest. That's the important part. In other words, when you have a vineyard, it's possible that you'll have grapes that fell before you harvested, that fell at some point later. Those are not pettit. It's very important. It's not that you're walking through a vineyard, all the little grapes, individualized grapes on the ground belong to the ani. Nish. While you are doing bitzira, which is the word that we use for harvesting grapes, during the act of harvesting, during the act of cutting off the cluster from the vine, if then one or two grapes fall off, they belong to the ani. Now, another detail of how limiting is the pettit. It's not only that it has to be b'shas habetzira, but more than that. If you're harvesting grapes and and the way you do it is you detach clusters, right? So you detach the cluster, and while you were detaching the cluster, huzbach be'olim, the cluster became entangled, huzbach, with leaves. And the leaf, or the entanglement and the tension that subsequently was a consequence of, that you're pulling it out of this entanglement. In other words, the leaves were part of the reason why a grape fell on the ground. The nafal haaretz v'nifrat is also harei shel baal habayis. In other words, the pettit is only if it fell because of the act of harvesting without any other outside cause. Verstehst? Even though you did it during harvesting, but if it got entangled and during this tug of war, grapes fell off, that will not belong to the ani. Now, says the Mishnah, if a person will place a basket on the ground underneath the vine, and why is he doing that? Because if, the fact when you harvest could be an individual grape or two will fall off. So you want them to be captured. And the Torah is saying that they belong to the poor. So you should know, you're robbing the poor. And al zen nemar, guys, we had this pasuk before, pasuk in Mishlei. The literal reading of the pasuk is al tasig gvul olam. Don't move back a eternal boundary or a long-standing boundary. And what we had on Daf Mem Zayin Amid Beis, actually, even according to some Agirse in the Mishnah, instead of the Mishnah writing what it says literally in Mishlei, olam al levav lamed mem, they add, whether it's the Mishnah, whether it's our interpretation in the Mishnah, that we add a yud in between the lamed and the mem, which means al taseh gevul oilim, don't intrude, don't move back the boundary of those who are ascending. If you remember that, who are ascending? Let's go with one of the approaches. The aniyim, because of their temporary, halavai, only temporary descent, financial descent, Belashin, saginod, as a euphemism, we call them ascending. We don't even want to say the word descend. We want to bless them. We also spoke out above that when a person financially or in any other area goes through anguish, it actually elevates them. So it's not only Belashin saginod, but be that as it may, we are applying this verse for aniyim that don't take, God put a boundary, which means something is theirs. Don't intrude into that by putting a basket on the ground. A lot more in the Gemara about this. It's a lot deeper than you think. Let's go back. So that's pettit. Now the Mishnah goes on to the Ezo Oilelos. Oilelos. You have to know how to pronounce it over here. Or Oilelos. So the main rule the Mishnah gives is the following. When you are harvesting the clusters, some of them will never fully develop. In other words, when we speak about an underdeveloped cluster, it's not pshat, it's underdeveloped, leave it on the tree another week. No. Let me say it like this, Kevin. I don't know if, let me hear what I'm saying, and then you'll find a picture if you could. We know this, we eat grapes. I mean, those of us who live in countries where you have access to grapes. So you have a cluster. A cluster will have a central stem. From the central stem grows out what we will call secondary stems. And a healthy, developed cluster will have many such secondary stems towards the top, meaning towards the part that's closest to the vine. And because of there being so many secondary stems from which grapes grow, it develops a ket of a shoulder. There is a greater width on the top of the cluster. And as it goes down, it becomes narrowed. And the native, which is called the drippings, means that in a healthy cluster at the bottom of the stem, farthest from the vine, farthest from the tree, there are not any more secondary stems. You only have the central stem, and you have a few grapes growing out of the central stem. And they're going to be like, it's like a tail, because it's only one stem from which grapes grow. The top is called a shoulder. The bottom that has grapes on the central stem is called a natev, a dripping. If a cluster has neither, that's what you have to leave on the tree for the poor. Neither means if it has one, even though it doesn't have the other, it still belongs to the owner. Let's read inside. Kol she'ein loy, not this nor that. Loy katev, loy natev, not a shoulder nor a dripping. However, in yesh loy katev and natev, right? If it has either or, you have to learn pshat in the Mishnah, not both. No, if it has either or, shel balabayis. And what happens in Suffolk? You can ask, take a look at it. Well, there are certain scenarios where, does it have a shoulder? Is that a shoulder? Is that enough to be defined as a shoulder? There's a doubt. So now we say, la'aniyim, like we spoke out in the intro, and that's a chiddush. In other words, just like we learned above, and Daf Mem Amud Beis from Sukkot, Safek, Leket, and the Gemara needed to get sources because the rule should have been, we don't say that by Leket, and subsequently, these matnas aniyim are compared one to the other. We do not say it when it comes to oiloless, nor to other of the matnas aniyim. So if there's a doubt, yes, it belongs to the un. Now, this next clause in the Mishnah will be needed, like we spoke out on the intro, to explain why a Levi who receives oiloless can use it for his tithing obligations. Because now the Mishnah will give a scenario where even if you have this underdeveloped cluster, it has neither shoulder nor a dripping, not a katef nor a natef. Nevertheless, when you harvest off the trees, let me tell you another scenario. You can have a branch. Now, what do I mean by a branch? A branch, Kevan, that from it many clusters grow out. When you harvest, you can either take off each cluster individually, or sometimes to facilitate, you cut off the entire branch. Now, if this branch has many clusters, it also has this underdeveloped cluster. But it wasn't that the balabas is taking cluster, and God says, leave the underdeveloped one. He cut off the whole branch. That's oilele sheba arkuva. Im nekrasima eshkoil. In other words, as long if there's one branch from which grows one underdeveloped cluster, it's oileless. You have to leave it for the poor. But if you have on this one branch other healthy clusters, even though one of them is an oileless, doesn't matter. In other words, when Hashem says, the lashon of the pasuk, that the bekan mechaloisa oilo, if you're taking off each one separately, don't take off the oil, leave it. But if you're taking off a whole branch, once you took it, you get to keep even the oileless that's on the branch. That's big. Vimlav he shall aniyim. Vimlav means that even though you didn't cut off the cluster, you cut off the entire branch. But if that's all you have on the branch, in other words, you can't say, I didn't take off the cluster. Yes, you did. You took off the branch that is completely subservient to this cluster, which the Torah says is not yours, and therefore, yes, you have to leave it for the poor. Now, we're going to have the final case in the Mishnah, which we have a machlokas tanoim, and different ways of understanding it. Let's read the words inside and then give one interpretation. Garger yechidi. Now, literally, it means if you have single grapes. What do we mean by a single grape? So, Kevin, we're speaking about a cluster. We're speaking about a cluster that only has a central stem. There aren't secondary stems. But there are so many grapes that are coming out of the central stem on the top, meaning near the vine. So many, and so little in the bottom, it looks like there is a shoulder and a dripping. But there isn't. Because the definition of a shoulder is, like we said, is that there are many secondary branches with grapes on the top. So it's like packed. Here, it's more packed on top than the bottom, but it's all coming from the central. In other words, it doesn't have a shoulder. Rabbi Yehuda Omer that Eshkoil, and actually, that Rabbi Yehuda will be the one that will have to be explained. But this de facto kevan does not have a shoulder, doesn't have a stem. We're speaking about, in other words, there is no grape in the bottom. There is no dripping in the bottom. Nevertheless, it looks like, so what that it looks like. It was the Chachamim who say that this is an relentless. If it doesn't have shoulder, it doesn't have a dripping, the bottom, the native means to drop, then it's shalaniyim. The Rabbi Yehuda holds that since it looks like it has, it's an eshkol, meaning it belongs to the balabaz, and Rabbi Yehuda will have to have a source for that, and he finds a pasuk for that. Okay, we're going to come back to that in the Gemara. That will be let's see how far we get. The Gemara is going to go back to the first din of the Mishnah. The Mishnah begins to define peret. The Mishnah says that if you put a basket under your vines, you're stealing from the aniyim. Now the question is, Kevin, why are you stealing from the aniyim? Let me ask you a simple thing. Like we said in the intro, if peret only belongs to the aniyim, when that grape hit the ground, if you put the basket preventing the grape from hitting the ground, you're not mamish stealing from the poor. So the presumption, the premise of the beginning of the Gemara, which will be changed, is that the fact that the Mishnah says you're stealing from the poor is anaya, that's a proof that it becomes property of the poor from the moment it left the cluster, from the moment it became detached. Hada amra, the fact that you're a gana, if you're stealing from the poor, peret, here are the words in the Gemara. Bin nishirase kadash. Kadash, I know the word is consecrated. It's not consecrated. Consecrated, it means it's now separated from everyone. Asur labalabas, because it's property of the poor. It happens not when it reaches the ground, but from its nishira, from when it became detached. That is the statement of the Gemara. And on that we have a following question. Should this rule not have been a response, an answer to the inquiry that Chilfi, which in the Bavli is Ilfa, did not know? Ilfe should have used this to answer a question. Why did he remain in doubt? What question are we referring to? Now, Ilfe, remember that he used to stand on the mast of a ship, and he would say that any question can be asked of me. Like he really knew. He knew everything. And the Chilfi Sha'al, he asked, or it was asked of him, that what? Leket. Now the question was about Leket. That Leket, the Nishirose Maushi Kadesh, Leket, similar to Peret. It's like the equivalent of Peret by grain, as we learned, that while you are doing the act of harvesting patches of grain, by grabbing it and with a sickle cutting it, if one or two ears fall out of your hand, right, from within the sickle, you have to leave it for the poor. And they asked of Ilfe, that question. What happens if it fell out of the hand of the harvester before it hit the ground? Let's say the owner grabbed it out of the ear. He chopped it. Is it his or is it the ani's? Now, Ilfi did not have an answer. Look inside before you turn the Amud, the last Marafulda in the Samachalaf Amadal, 5 lines from the bottom. Should we not be able to resolve the inquiry that it was asked from him, does it become property of the poor when it falls out of the hand of the harvester, meaning it only becomes property of the poor when it hits the ground? And Ilfi had no answer, but Ilfi, he knew everything. And seemingly, our Mishnah, he should have known it over here. Right, the second to last line, that yes, that it's already property of the poor. V'hachinami, right, that's what we're saying over here. So v'hachinami leket, shuneget, haperet shabekedim. It's mamish lek. It's not only that we juxtapose all of the matnasanim together. It's more than that. Leket and peret is the same. What peret is for the vine is leket for the grain. So why did he not know how to resolve it? Turning to Daf Samach Aleph Amud Beis, answers the Gemara. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Avduma, that I disagree with your premise. The reason why Ilfei Chilfei did not know is because when he learned this Mishnah, he also did not know. Don't tell me that since the Mishnah says that you're Goizel Aniyim, that's a raya that in Nishirasai Kadash. No, maybe technically, Kevan, it only belongs to the poor when it hits the ground. Technically. But the Mishnah can make the statement, why are we quoting a pasuk in the Mishnah? Say, Loi Sigzoi, Loi Sigmoi. Adarabba, we quote a pasuk from the Chumash. Because it's not technical theft, because maybe actually it's not yet the poor's. Maybe it only becomes the poor's when it hits the ground. But come on, it's falling on the ground. It's about to hit the ground. So you putting a basket underneath it, right? You putting the basket, you're causing for the ani not to get what God wanted him to receive. In other words, it's not a halachic theft, it's an ethical theft, which makes more sense why we're quoting a pasuk in Mishlei instead of quoting a pasuk in Chumash.
Even if it doesn't hit the ground and you put netting around it, it's the same thing, correct?
Yeah. In other words, there is the letter
of the ground
of the law.
So as soon as it falls off the vine.
Even if you're going to tell me that technically it only belongs to the poor when it hits the ground, the Mishnah is telling us that it's not ethical for you to prevent it from falling on the ground. Very good. Shan Yohi, meaning it's still not okay. It's different. It's not the bona fide owners. It already fell off. It was going to hit the ground without you doing an action prior. So not robbing. Look inside the maraf, the top maraful, the Shan Yohi, ze emes. The leket shel shvur peret shel kerem chadehi. I agree that they are the same. And therefore, if Ilfa would have known for sure the meaning or the din by peret, he would have applied it to leket. The reason why he remained with the doubt on leket is because he didn't know how to touch peret. Why? Not that it's not that for sure is the meaning of our Mishnah, but it could be. That why is the Tana using the words? Wow, strong words. You're gzela. Even if it's not halachically the poorest, nevertheless, havale gezel. Why? Because your basket placing causes it not to touch the ground, and and nimtzu goizel oisan. How bigrama didei? And no one should come over here and prove anything other than ethics, because that's exactly the meaning of the Gemara. Goizel asaniyim could mean kepshutai, and we're quoting a pasuk in Mishlei because that pasuk is specifically about matnas aniyim, right? Oilam oilim, or it's an ethical issue. Okay, Atkan is the Gemara's added point when it comes to peret, and what's great over here is that the Gemara is really ultimately going to add two more prerequisites by oilers, which is huge, but that's the way it works. So first of all, the Mishnah says Ezoi leilois, and the Mishnah gave two points, and both are needed, like we said. No, it's for it to become to the ani. It calls she'elot. This must be a cluster that does not have like katef, not the shoulder, not a packed bunch of secondary stems that come out of the central stem, upon which comes out grapes. Native is the dripping, is the bottom couple of grapes that do grow from the central stem, and those are not there, nor are their shoulders. Now, quotes the Gemara Tiseftom, and that's already explicit, as we learned in the Mishnah, because the Mishnah spoke on both sides. The Mishnah didn't say either or in the way on the other direction. Yesh la katev avaloy native, or native aloy katev. Clearly, even if the cluster is lacking one of these two, it still belongs to the balabais. It only belongs to the poor if it lacks both. Clear, the fetish in the Baraisa, more than in the Mishnah. And as we had in the Mishnah, the im safek lanium. Now, how can there be a safek kavan? Well, I can tell you two things. First of all, I can say maybe there's a certain gray area of there are some secondary, not enough secondary. I can also say that a safek could be that by the time you look at it right now, the owner had a doubt when he was harvesting it. When you come back to the tree, could be more grapes fell off it. You don't know if it was that way yesterday. Could be when you were harvesting it. Could be then it did have a shoulder. Now, you don't know. It's even when you look at it now, a day after you harvested, it doesn't have neither the shoulder nor the dripping. Sometimes you can say, yesterday it looked a little bit fuller. It's either you don't know the halacha or you don't know how it was. Whichever one, then still we say la'aniyim.
Why should the aniyim get the secondary clusters? Why?
God said so. What do you mean?
I mean,
why by a doubt? We said even though normally but we had a daf mem amid base in the Ois V'Hadar's that pagination. We had a source for suffix leket. So suffix oiloless, meaning lani. Now, Ezui ketef, here the Tosefta the Brisa goes into greater detail. What is the shoulder? Pesigim zu al gabzu. Pesigim means secondary stems. And it's not only that there are secondary stems. That's not enough. They have to be one on top of the other. They have to be one rest. It gives the appearance of a broad-shouldered cluster. Ezuhu neitef. What's a dripping? He says the dripping refers to the grapes that are teluyas bashidra. In other words, there are at the end of the cluster. You have the grapes that dafka don't grow out of secondary stems. They grow out of the shidra, the spine, the central stem. And the yardas. And they go down. It goes down a little bit. So there is like this tail, this dripping, like a drop at the bottom. And this cluster does not have it. It has to lack a dripping. Says the Gemara, this is not written in a Mishnah nor in a Braisa. That's a great example. That's a great picture. So what you see clearly here is that whoever's looking at the picture, that the grapes on the top of the cluster are much broader. It's wider because they're more secondary. And what you need in the bottom is the bottom grape. The bottom grape will be called the native. The bottom grape is coming directly out of the central stem. Okay. Now, says the Gemara Rabba, which is Rabbi Shem Rabbi Yehuda. Even if you have a cluster that's lacking both, so in the Mishnah, lacking both, that's oiloless. That belongs to the port. No, there's something else. And this something else, Kevan, is really two, not one. The Hon, which this is only that this underdeveloped cluster has to be small enough in order for it to fit in, let's say, in an average hand when placed in it. But really, this has two details. One detail is it has to fit into a person's hands. The other detail is that the grapes have to be so sparsely distributed, the heads, that all of the grapes are touching the palm. Because even if it's small, it's underdeveloped, by the way, it means it's not going to grow bigger. It's not that, leave it on the tree longer. It's stunted. It's not going to develop. It's going to remain underdeveloped. That even if it's small, if it's packed, even though there's no shoulder and there's no dripping, if it's packed, not all the grapes will touch my hand because one will touch another grape that's touching my hand. No, it has to be really sparse. It has to be really lacking. It's mamash underdeveloped. Every single grape is touching my hand. It needs both of them. Wow. Now, why wouldn't the Mishnah mention it? But that's the way it works. That's the way it works. Maybe Rabbi HaKadosh was hinting to it. Okay, now challenges the Gemara that loikein amar abchia. I got a problem, and we would definitely prefer for there not to be a machlokes now amarayim regarding this, given that Rabbi did not write explicitly. How do we know that Rabbi argued? But from a mice shaklu. Now we're going to go with the gear. So oileles achas. There was a time that there was one oileless, probably oilelois or oileless, singular. One meaning, Kevan, it was a cluster, did not have neither the kotef nor the native, but it was so large that it weighed the weight of seven Sipoidian litras. And when it comes to measures, we're going to have this in other places. We had this in the Bavli a few times. That there were times that different locations had different measures. Sipoidi had a larger litra than usual, so it was one it weighed 7 tzipoidian liters, which means it weighed a lot. It means it was large. Now, what does that imply? That Rabbi does have this tradition. It's not just ketev and negev. That if it lacks both, but if it's big, if it's very big, it won't belong to the ani. But you know what very big means? Very big means weighing 7 liters. If we're going to use the shear of your palm, of the hand, you can have an oilala that is bigger than the palm of your hand. It will not weigh 7 liters. The fact that we use that as a story, it implies that smaller than that will be oilaless. But we're saying no, we're saying the palm of the hand. So therefore, Amar Abchinanam, that She'im Nisana al Gabi Tabla. The way we will learn Pshat is that either we are arguing, I don't think we're arguing, we're saying that the pas is maybe is not the palm of your hand, pas yodai, but there used to be a standard writing tablet that people will keep in their hands. We learned about it, and they would put the wax, right? And then they would kratz out whatever they have to write, and then they would reuse it. So there was a standard size tableau. And if the oilelos does not fit within the tableau, the second prerequisite we're not challenging. Not only does it have to fit within, now the tableau, which is much bigger than a pas yadai, every single grape has to touch the surface of the tableau. You need to have both. But instead of it being a pas yadai, we are making something relatively larger that is held the pas yadai, and that very good, and that had a standard size, and that mamish fits with what happened in Ma'aseh Rabbi. That's more or less the share. In other words, if it goes beyond that, I know Ma'aseh Shoya Kachoya, but that's more or less, we're quoting that story. Why are we quoting that story? Because more or less, if it doesn't fit in the tabla, it's going to weigh the 7 litra. If it fits in the tabla or smaller, it's not going to have that weight. Okay. Says the Gemara Vayta. We have a ruling. Ben Levi shenesmanu le'maiser tevel. So a Yisrael, right? Truma Gedoyla. After he separates Truma Gedoyla, he's going to give now from what remains Maiser Rishon 10% of what remains to the Levi. When the Levi receives it, he receives Maiser Rishon. It's called tevel, because he still has to separate from it another 10%. What happens if the Levi shenesmanuloi meiser tevel, that he gets meiser rishon, which is still tevel, because you have to still separate trumas meisers, umatzah b'toicha oileilos, and some of what he received is oileilos. And therefore, you would think that, first of all, it's a double thing. The owner who gave it to him, the owner has to give 10%. Including that which was not yours in the 10%, we're not going to focus on that, but just to be aware of that. That means that the owner's remaining product is not Ma'aseh Rishon yet. But we're not focusing. The same issue. The Ben Levi who got it, what will he do? Now, there's 2 things that he can do, Kevin. One thing is that he separates from what he received 10%, and he gives it to a coin. The other thing he can do is that, let's say he received 10 pounds. This Levi has another 90 pounds of Ma'aseh Rishon that also need to be Trumad Ma'aseh. He can take all of this and make a declaration. All of this, what I received, should be the Ma'aseh Min HaMa'aseh for everything that I have everywhere else. And then give all of it to the coin, which is what he did in the case over here. Point that the statement is that he can use the oilerless, whether it's one, whether it's a few, as part of the solution of removing the tevel status of his Ma'aseh Rishon by giving it to the kohen. And obviously the question will be, how can he do that? If you see, it doesn't have a cape, it doesn't have a native. Let's go further. And it's small. It's not bigger than the tablet. It's sparse. We see it's an oilelos. Nevertheless, it says the Gemara, it doesn't have to be only that the Levi is giving all of this for that which he has everywhere else. It's the same thing. He can give from it to it. The problem is, how can you do that? Answers the Gemara, that's the whole reason why we emphasize that clause in the Mishnah, that if you, right, right, that's the words, if you have clusters that are in this larger branch, and the farmer took off the whole branch that has on it other normal clusters, in that case, it belongs to the Malamites. So even though we said the rule Safek, oilerless, that's on the Balabas. Once the Levi received it, his presumption should be that what the owner gave him is not oilerless. And therefore, he can also use it as normal Lamaisadishin. The answer that we have in the names of the rabbis in Bavel, Ani Oimer, says Rabbi, or B'Shem them, because it could be that Ani Oimer means I am allowed to presume. I'm allowed to say that they were removed, like we mentioned, together with other proper clusters on this larger branch, and the farmer did not harvest them individually. Ubemela, he gets to keep it, and that is the Chiddush. Safek, oilerless is on the owner, not on the recipient, not on the Levi.
Rabbi, in other cases, it depended on who the owner was. When we studied other similar laws, we had to see if the owner is a Sadiq, whatever the differentiation.
No. We are all presuming. Okay, what you're saying is true, but it's not related only to here. That means that whenever you have a suspicion, when it comes to everything, I buy kosher food. What happens if I suspect, I know the mashgiach, I know something that you don't know. If I feel that there's a problem, then I have to be careful. Have a suffix. Right? Suffix gezel, we don't want to get in there. We're speaking about a person that doesn't know. And the presumption is, Kol Yisrael b'chas kaskash. But good point. Now, the case in the Mishnah, the final case, where we have a machlekes, the chachamim, God gave Yechidi, and as we explained, that even though it appears that it has a ketev and a natev, it appears. But it does not, and therefore the sheet of the chachamim that say it's oilerless, it belongs to the ani, it doesn't have this, or doesn't have that. Problem is, why will Rabbi Yehuda say that it's an eshkoil? That's why we only explain Rabbi Yehuda and Amar Rab Simen, time of the Rabbi Yehuda. That the nishar boy, we're quoting a pasuk from Yeshayahu. The nishar bar oileilois, and you will have these oileilois left, and the pasuk defines it kenoikev zayis shnayim shloisha garganim, like one who harvests an olive tree and leaves a couple of individual ones on the top. But what expression is used? 2 or 3. Just like when you leave 2 or 3, you have to leave it for the poor. We're speaking about the pasuk there about an olive tree. It doesn't matter, but the Torah uses the words oileilois, and we're saying 2 or 3, implying, listen to this anudin, that any cluster that has more than 2-3 grapes, Kaven, no Ketev and no native. It's the most sparse cluster, but it has 4 grapes. Notice Rabbi Yehuda's understanding of Eilelos is completely different. Yoiser Mikan, any cluster that has more than 2 or 3. Now the question is, why do you have to write 2 when it's 3? But let's go with the 3. It's Rabbi Yehuda, not Eilelos. Yes, it's a bona fide eshkol cluster, and that belongs to the Balabas. And that's exactly what the Mishnah is saying, that you should know that our definition of the Eilelos is Kachachamim. Rabbi Yehuda limits a lot more the Eilelos. It will fit a lot more with the Peret. We're saying by the Peret it's 2, not 3. Here we're saying 3, Shnayim Shloisha, but not 4. Well, we'll stop over here. I know we have another couple of minutes. And Dolma, right, 3 lines from the bottom, Dolma means that this should be said. This should be Omar. In other words, a story. A story is going to be told, and we're going to start speaking about the phenomenal, even not only beruchnias, but even the physical qualities of the fruits of Eretz Yisrael. I know in the Babli we had a whole sugya of Pedas Genoisar, if you remember. But here comes something about the chavivus of the gift that God gives us, which is the Holy Land of Israel. To be continued.
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi. Thank you.